Normal episodic memory operates linearly. An event occurs, and as time passes, it recedes into history, a closed narrative chapter you can choose to recall. Traumatic memory operates in a closed loop. The event never recedes. Instead, it endlessly cycles in the present tense, demanding an immediate physical response to a threat that has already ended. These scans reveal a physical shift in the architecture of PTSD, a localized physiological reorganization of the central nervous system. We know this because of script-driven neuroimaging studies, pioneered by researchers at Harvard Medical School and the University of Western Ontario, which placed trauma survivors inside fMRI and PET scanners and recorded their neural activity as they experienced induced flashbacks. For the first time, these scans provided a physical blueprint of a mind overwhelmed by its own history. They show us precisely which neurological structures collapse during trauma, disabling the human capacity for time, speech, and context. To understand how trauma reorganizes the brain, we first have to look at the normal baseline of our threat response architecture, specifically the dynamic between the ancient limbic system, which manages our survival instincts, and the newer neocortex, which manages conscious thought. In healthy operation, raw sensory information, sights, sounds, and physical sensations, flows into a limbic structure called the thalamus. The thalamus acts as the brain's cook. It blends these disparate sensory ingredients into a coherent, chronological, autobiographical narrative. It tells you, this is what is happening to me right now. That integrated sensory data is then rapidly passed down to the amygdala. The amygdala functions as the brain's smoke detector. It assesses the data for threats. If it detects danger, it completely bypasses conscious thought and takes the low road, instantly triggering an autonomic fight or flight response. Meanwhile, that same sensory data takes a slightly slower route up to the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC, located in the frontal lobe. The MPFC is the watchtower. Its job is to objectively assess the threat from a higher vantage point. If the smoke detector triggered over burnt toast, the watchtower sends an inhibitory signal down to the amygdala to shut off the alarm. Normal psychological functioning relies entirely on this balance. The executive neocortex must be able to successfully modulate the limbic system. In traumatized brains, that balance shatters. Consider the case of Marcia, a patient who underwent an fMRI scan while listening to an audio script recounting the details of a catastrophic car accident she survived 13 years earlier. This is a composite map of Marcia's brain activity during the flashback. The most pronounced anomaly is a stark white void in the left frontal lobe. A decrease in color here indicates a significant drop in metabolic activity. That specific void is Broca's area, the speech center of the brain. During a flashback, it simply goes completely offline. The clinical consequence of a suppressed Broca's area is profound. The patient becomes physically incapable of translating their traumatic thoughts and somatic feelings into language. The terror is trapped inside the body, entirely inaccessible to words. At the exact same time, a region at the back of the brain, Brodmann's Area 19, lights up with intense activation. Area 19 is located in the visual cortex. Its function is to register raw, uninterpreted visual images the moment they enter the brain. The intense activation here means Marcia's brain is processing the memory of the accident not as a past event, but as an active, real-time visual feed hitting her retinas in the present moment. Trauma is literally pre-verbal. It disables the brain's neurological capacity to communicate the experience, while simultaneously trapping the survivor in a raw, unprocessed visual assault. We see the structural failures even more clearly in a patient named Stan. Stan was scanned 3 months after surviving a massive 87-car highway pileup in dense fog. When subjected to a script of his accident, Stan's fMRI revealed a massive, bright flare of activation isolated deep in the right lower center of his brain. That localized flare is a hyperactivated amygdala. The smoke detector is interpreting the audio script as a literal matter of life and death, driving a severe, unmitigated spike in adrenaline and cortisol through his autonomic nervous system. Notice the central frontal lobe, the location of the MPFC watchtower. It is entirely dark. Without the MPFC online to provide executive oversight, the brain loses its objective capacity to analyze the environment. It cannot distinguish between a harmless audio recording in a safe laboratory and an actual present-tense threat to survival. The subjective experience of panic in a PTSD flashback is never an overreaction. It is a direct, proportional result of the autonomic nervous system completely bypassing cognitive oversight. Stan's scan also reveals deactivations in the peripheral frontal regions of the brain, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC. The DLPFC serves as the brain's internal timekeeper. It analyzes our current experience and places it on a timeline, understanding how it relates to the past and how it might impact the future. When the DLPFC goes offline, the patient loses the neurological concept of a future. Without a timekeeper to signal that an event has an endpoint, the current state of visceral terror feels interminable. Further down in the lower half of the brain, we see two dark holes. This is the thalamus, completely deactivated. Remember that the thalamus is the brain's cook. When it fails, sensory integration stops. The brain can no longer synthesize sights, sounds, and smells into a cohesive story. Instead, the memory fractures into isolated, overwhelming sensory imprints. Without a working timekeeper to put the event in the past, and without an integrative cook to organize the data into a narrative, a traumatic flashback becomes an endless, contextless sensory assault. However, extreme trauma does not always manifest as hyperarousal. This is the scan of Stan's wife, Ut, who was sitting right next to him during the exact same highway pileup. Her scan shows massive, near-global deactivation. Her neural map is essentially blanked out. During the script, her heart rate remained steady, and she reported feeling nothing at all. This is the biological footprint of depersonalization and severe dissociation. Dissociation is an evolutionary freeze response, when a stimulus is too psychologically intolerable to process and physical escape is impossible. The brain executes a survival strategy by drastically reducing its own metabolic activity. It shuts itself down. PTSD exists on a spectrum of extreme autonomic dysregulation. Depending on the patient, the brain's defense systems will drive them toward explosive hyperreactivity or plunge them into profound, life-draining systemic shutdown. For decades, the dominant medical paradigm has treated trauma-related disorders purely as neurochemical imbalances, prescribing SSRIs like Prozac or heavy antipsychotics to correct the issue. We know what SSRIs do in a traumatized brain. Supplying serotonin artificially dampens the amygdala's reactivity, turning the volume down on the smoke detector. But this doesn't repair disabled regions. As the map shows, Broca's, the DLPFC, and the thalamus remain dark and disconnected. Psychopharmacology makes day-to-day survival bearable for the patient, but it does not repair the structural disconnection caused by the trauma. This structural reality exposes the fallacy of relying solely on talk therapy. You cannot reason with a hyperactivated amygdala. To reintegrate the brain, clinicians must employ bottom-up regulation, accessing the autonomic nervous system via the brainstem, using rhythmic movement and controlled breathing. By recalibrating the body's baseline physiology first, bottom-up regulation physically proves to the organism that the danger has passed, finally quieting the alarm system. Once the autonomic nervous system is regulated from the bottom up, the clinical threshold is crossed. The offline executive regions of the brain can finally reboot and come back online. Trauma resolution depends on first restoring the patient's visceral sense of safety in the body. Only then can the rational mind process the fragments, re-establish the timeline, and turn a present-tense terror into a past-tense memory.